Okay, we'll call to order the March 17th meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission. We don't have a very large group here in attendance tonight, so I guess we'll just ask Ms. Twitchell to silence any electronic devices. Sounds like we're good there. Heather, please call the roll.
Phyllis McKee. Here. Garrett O'Brien.
Here.
Steve Crooks.
Here.
Lisa Anderson. Here. Ali Taishi, Tom Grinstead, and Jeff Brown have been excused.
Slackers. We don't have any minutes to approve, so we have a public comment period at this time for anybody that'd like to speak on any topic other than tonight's work session, which is the economic development chapter or the environmental chapter. So no takers there. So we're going to move on in. Tonight's a continuation of our comprehensive plan update. We're going to be looking at the economic development chapter and the environmental chapter tonight. And we'll get started with staff presentation. Are we doing the economic development first? Yep, okay, yeah, it's right there. All right. So we'll get started with the presentations. I think if the commission's okay, I think what would be good is we'll try to get both presentations tonight. So we'll get the first presentation and then we'll do a round of just quick kind of clarifying questions. Take the second presentation, take public comment for anybody that'd like to speak, and then we could get into a little bit more detailed discussion about both chapters. I think that worked well last time, just being able to bounce back and forth while we have everybody here. So we'll do that.
Yeah, let's just jump right in. So, Ms.
Not staying on.
Mine's not.
Hopefully the mic will work. No? Maybe that's why they were twisted. How are we doing? Okay. Okay, good evening. Tara Sundin. I'm the Community and Economic Development Manager for the City of Bellingham. And I'm here to present kind of a little background on the Economic Development chapter and then talk about the updates that we're proposing for this chapter. This is a little different than some of the chapters you're reviewing. This is a new chapter. We adopted our first Economic Development chapter in 2013. So the City Council, coming out of a recession or actually in a recession when they gave us the task, didn't want to wait for this update that we're in right now. And so they asked us to go ahead and proceed in developing the chapter. I think a couple of you might have been here when we brought this to you in 2013. A couple of things we were looking at when we were developing this chapter is, first of all, working on a new format. So you'll see that a lot of the other chapters that are being brought forward to you, or most of them, are utilizing the format in the economic development chapter, which is looking at a little more brevity, so that we can ensure that people are going to utilize this document a little more than maybe they are today. A couple other things we wanted to take a look at is, first of all, defining what economic development was. So what we learned is economic development meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and sometimes people would just use the term economic development, especially in that recession. It's like economic development, but it's like, what do we mean by that? So we wanted to make sure we defined that, and we defined that as the creation of jobs and the creation of wealth, in addition to the improvement of the quality of life for all of us that live here in Bellingham and all of us that work here in Bellingham. We also wanted to define what the city's role is. So we're not the only player in economic development. In fact, we're a supporter in a lot of ways of economic development. We talk about who really does create those jobs, and it's really the businesses that create jobs. But we recognize that the city has a really important role in creating the climate in which businesses can prosper and grow and feel welcome here. So we defined our role, and there's kind of three primary roles that we have. One is to provide the leadership to create that positive business environment, and it takes that leadership to continue investing in the amenities that are important to those that want to live here or that do live here, that want to invest here. Also provide that leadership as far as taxation and keeping an eye on making sure that we're still a friendly place to do business. Something that you're looking at right now, and a really critical role for the city, is to ensure that we have an adequate land supply to allow those businesses that we have to grow and expand, or to allow those new businesses to come in to our community. And of course, to make sure that we have the infrastructure capacity to support that. And we want to make sure that as we're planning for that growth, we can afford to accommodate that growth. And that infrastructure that we provide here is really significant to those businesses. We're talking about things that we don't think about that often, which is water and sewer and roadways to get to your businesses, and make sure that we have freight, et cetera. So that's a really, that's kind of one of our primary kind of roles. And then to ensure that we are providing excellent services, and that goes beyond just making sure that we have a great library system and we have really good police and fire, but also making sure that we're investing and we're always working on improving our permitting system and our land use regulations to make sure that we're not burdening people to the point where they're like, want to go somewhere else. So those are kind of the three roles that we've identified. And then the chapter is broken down into kind of 5 main categories or areas of focus. And those are positive business environment, which I talked about, economic diversification. That's a really important one for Bellingham. We've seen ourselves go through a few transitions from, a very resource-based economy, that when that moment of change occurs and we're so involved in timber, that we lose that economy. And I think we're seeing some evidence of the retail. We're a service. We have a pretty heavily service-based economy, and part of that's because we're the regional center of the county, but another is because of our proximity to Canada. And we want to make sure that we can't control Canada's economy. But when their dollar weakens, we see some impact here. So the more diverse our economy can become, the stronger we will be. And so we want to see those wages go up in our city. I think you guys are probably well aware that we're below the state average, below the national average on income. And some of that is because of our retail emphasis. So we want to strive for some higher wages. Land and infrastructure, that's something we're working on now. Vibrant commercial centers. If you look at the chapter, that whole section is really focused on our urban villages. Our urban villages are certainly, and I'm sure you've talked about them in the housing chapter, I think you've already talked through, and land use. And they're certainly important for accommodating infill in the terms of where people are going to live. But they're also really important to accommodate some of those jobs that we want beyond retail, those upper floor jobs that we want to see grow here in our community. Also, those urban centers do more for us just than serving that one place. Our downtown is kind of that indicator for our whole community and really beyond Bellingham. As the stronger our downtown is and the stronger our city center is, that kind of filters through as kind of a signal for health in our community. It's something that we need to keep an eye on as well. And then quality of life is also incredibly important. We don't spend a lot of time on it in this chapter as a lot of policies because we have so many in the other chapters. The other piece I want to mention here is a lot of our comprehensive plan goals and policies in other chapters, whether it's land use or housing, support economic development. We don't want to duplicate what we're saying in other chapters. So that's kind of where we headed. And then, of course, we have the goals and policies outlined. I've got just now a real brief presentation for you to talk about the state, the GMA, a little background on some of the changes that we're proposing. The focus areas, I think I made a mistake by calling it key changes. I think we're talking about the focus areas. You guys have identified like housing and urban villages that you want to look at in each of these chapters, and then Lisa will discuss the schedule moving forward. So this chapter is not a requirement of GMA. So cities like Bellingham are not required to have an economic development chapter. Whatcom County is, all the counties are, but Bellingham is not. We've chosen to do so. When we chose to do so, and the state says that's great, but when you do that, we want to make sure there's certain things that you cover in the chapter, and that's a summary of the economy, our local economy, which we've done, a summary of the strengths and weaknesses. We conducted a SWOT analysis, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's an appendix to the chapter, and then also under each one of those categories, we summarize, like under positive business environment, we do a little summary of kind of those key strengths and weaknesses for that category. And then, of course, the identification of policies, programs, and projects. One of the things that we outlined in the economic development chapter was the need for an economic development strategic action plan, which you all have on your, I think, in front of you tonight. That document was adopted by our city council just this last year. It follows the primary goals under positive business environment, economic diversification, et cetera. And then we take that policy and we focus on strategies and actions to implement that policy. So a lot of the specifics of what, as far as projects are happening, you'll find in that document, not in the policy document of the comprehensive plan. So I've already talked about the 2013 edition. So the changes that we're proposing, this is a new chapter, especially for planners. We feel like we just adopted this yesterday. It's just a couple of years old, so we are not actually proposing significant changes to it. So we've updated the data, and we have also updated the employment capacity map. And then we've done some real slight modifications to certain policies, not very many of them, mostly based on feedback internally from our staff. We have not gotten significant feedback from the community. In fact, we've gotten really positive feedback about not only this chapter, but specifically about adopting the strategic action plan and being more forward-thinking with economic development goals for our community. And then we've adopted, sorry, now I'm not on my notes page. I tried it. We are recommending one new policy. So we had Whatcom County Health review the comp plan, I think all the chapters. And in their review of this one, they're recommending we add a policy. It's ED 48, and it's to encourage locally based food production, distribution, and choice through the support of community gardens, farmers markets, and other small-scale initiatives. So that's the only new policy that we're proposing, and no significant changes to the plan. On the second page of the memo that accompanies your packet, it's a memo from me. On the second page, there are those 5 focus areas of housing, urban villages, health, sustainability, and innovation. And I understand that's kind of the lens at which you wanted to look at each chapter or through this comp plan process. And so actually our existing plan incorporates goals and policies in each of those areas. So for housing, for instance, it's to support workforce housing, to foster living wage jobs and job training, to improve permitting processes, to review taxes, fees, and rates, to invest in amenities to support housing and businesses in urban villages, and to offer incentives to promote economic development. Incentives, the city actually just adopted a whole slate of incentives to help us out with our urban villages, Samish and downtown, Old Town Fountain, and then some specific ones with regard to B&O taxes. And I think we might have one of the more innovative incentive programs in the state as a result of that. And that's due to having some good policy language here in our plan that allowed us to go ahead and take those steps just a couple months ago. Urban villages, I mentioned that whole section on creating vibrant commercial centers is about our focus on urban villages. Health, to prioritize health care and food processing as desirable employment sectors for Bellingham. Link local food system to development, that's the new policy that we're recommending. And then to strive to maintain level of service standards. Sustainability, support historic preservation and adaptive reuse, employ sustainable practices, encourage cleanup of contaminated sites, so city-owned sites that we need to clean up, and then to encourage others to do so as well or support them in those efforts, and to foster a healthy community. And then finally, in innovation, to encourage innovation and entrepreneurial activities, to foster a healthy environment, to support the development of technology and telecommunication. So, kind of a little outline. Lisa, do you want to walk them through the schedule?
Oh, sure. Just wanted to touch briefly on what's coming up next. So on 3/31, you'll see the community design chapter as well as the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan. And then on April 7th, we'll hold a public hearing on all the chapters. And we did add a new work session on April 14th. And then hopefully we'll be able to wrap it all up on April 21st.
On the 14th, on the 7th, when we have the public hearing, is that when you guys are going to kind of synthesize some of the draft changes and suggestions that the Planning Commission has made and propose the rework drafts at that public hearing so that the public can comment on those?
Yeah, we will have the list of the changes that the commission has discussed.
So they won't be redlined in the chapter. It'll be more like a comment tracker type.
Exactly. We'll have an easy for you to follow sort of a checklist of all of the changes that have been discussed. So you'll be able to just go through them, and then as a group decide whether you want to recommend those or not. But
Okay.
we won't be making changes to the original document. We want people to be able to see what was originally proposed,
separate.
and then they'll be able to see the changes that the commission's recommending on a separate document.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Do you have any questions?
You got questions for Tara? We'll take the other person. I had a quick question just on, in the beginning here, you talked about just continuing to build working relationships in Whatcom County with the port and other groups. What other kind of business groups does the city collaborate with in regards to, with economic development?
So I work with the Port of Bellingham. We work closely in all of our departments, pretty much. The Chamber of Commerce,
Okay.
Western Washington Small Business Development Center, Technology Alliance Group. Let me see how many I can remember off the top. There's about 12 to 15 of them.
Downtown Bellingham Partnership.
Downtown Partnership, Sustainable Connections. We connect with the BIA. There's a slew
Okay.
of them, yeah. And some of them we fund. The city actually provides funding. For example, we fund the Small Business Development Center so that they can provide free, confidential business counseling to our businesses. So while our staff's not providing that direct service to businesses to help them grow or stabilize, we're providing funding to allow that to happen. So we do that through funding and then sometimes just other partnerships.
Good, thank you. Steve's got a comment, but quick, can you define workforce housing? Guys, you see this kind of throughout the document. I mean, just a layman's description of workforce housing.
So we talk about workforce housing and in being able to accommodate. So affordable housing is used a lot. Workforce, affordable housing in some terms can mean low-income housing. But in workforce, we want to make sure that our whole workforce has housing that's affordable to them. So it's a whole range.
Okay, access to housing for working people.
Yes.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, Tara, does the city have an outreach program to participate in trade shows, real estate development, other types of activities outside of this area to sell Bellingham business opportunities?
So the Port of Bellingham is the county's, we call it the Associate Development Organization, which is recognized and designated by Whatcom County, but recognized by the state of Washington as our kind of point of entry, point of contact for economic development. And specifically, they're focused on inbound, so recruitment. So the port's employed 2 individuals that do go to trade shows and do go represent Bellingham, and that's getting ramped up. Right now, we're about ready, and I'll share it with you. It's going to go live here in a couple weeks. We've developed a really positive message about our community and a very welcoming website that's a portal for anyone coming in to do business here in Whatcom County, not just Bellingham. And the port's kind of our primary area that they come into them so they can keep track, and then they might come to me where if it's appropriate, or to the SBDC. They're that kind of point of contact, if you will. But the city, we aren't out in other communities recruiting. Economic development staff, direct like this, is like part of me and a little bit of Darby, if you know Darby. So Bellingham has more than any other small city, but we're not Seattle and Tacoma as far as the level of resources go. And most of our resources are focused on growing our existing businesses. So you'll hear the mayor talk quite a bit about that. That's number one, is making sure the businesses that are already here can grow and prosper. Also working on those startups, because once business starts here and they grow here, they're likely to maybe stay here, hopefully. It's hard to get businesses to move because it's costly to businesses. So recruitment efforts are important, but they're not our primary. But we're trying to get our message out there a little bit more. We've been a little kind of, I don't want to say hold up, but we want to get out there and be a little more, a lot more welcoming, I guess you would say.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll go through the second presentation, which will be the environmental chapter, and then we'll take public comment, and we'll have our discussion.
Good evening. I'm Kim Wheel. I'm the environmental planner with the City Planning Department. And the environment chapter addresses the main environmental features and values of Bellingham. And as you can see from these photos, the environment provides a lot of beauty to our community. And I wanted to focus on this picture in particular. You can tell it's Lake Whatcom, and it's taken overlooking Basin 1, we call it, which is where the city jurisdiction is. And then beyond this little sill here is Basin 2. You've probably heard of these before. I don't know if you've ever seen a photo. And then beyond this other sill, whoopsie, sorry. Beyond this sill is Basin 3, the deepest and largest basin. And then the lake in all is 10 miles long, so you can't even see the end of it. But I wanted to show you this because in the news lately, we've heard a lot about threats to drinking water supplies. And Lake Whatcom serves over 100,000 people. So not just the city of Bellingham, but in addition to that. And so you can see how integral it would be to include it in our comprehensive plan. And indeed, you heard about it a little bit probably in the capital facilities draft chapter, and you'll hear more about it tonight in the environment chapter. Tonight, my presentation will cover the state GMA requirements, a little bit of background, and then the key changes. So like Tara said about the economic development chapter, the environment chapter is also not a required element like, say, transportation or capital facilities. But we have a lot of requirements to meet, and I noticed too that Tara's mentioned high quality of life. That's kind of a common theme through GMA and all kinds of, all the elements really. But in order to meet our GMA requirements that you can see here on the screen, we had to house them somewhere, and we have a lot of environmental infrastructure. We thought, why not make a roadmap for the environment, just like we do for transportation, if you will. The Shoreline Master Program is a required element, so that is in the environment chapter. So we had to add that anyway, but you'll see what we've folded in besides that, and mostly it's those main environmental features I mentioned. Lake Whatcom is one of those. In addition, you know, it does provide policies for critical area protection, and then it ensures that our growth is consistent with community values. That's something you'll hear more about. It's important that our chapters do that, and I'll show you how we're doing it. In 2012, let's see, we came to our department head and then to City Council in 2011 and said that we would like to add an environment chapter to our comp plan. Like I said, the roadmap that we thought we needed. And so in 2012, we did create this, but it was limited to just compiling the existing goals and policies at the time. And they were sprinkled throughout the plan, the comp plan. So we didn't change any of those chapters. We just repeated those in the environment chapter, and we wrote a piece, introductory paragraphs about those other main features, Lake Whatcom, climate change, fish and wildlife habitat, things like that. And so we just compiled everything together in that 2012 version, because we knew that we would do the update in this 2016 update cycle. And that was the plan, and that's exactly why we're here tonight. It reflects public input in the sense that when we were just recently updating the Critical Area Ordinance, we heard a common theme, and that was that the community wanted to see better protection of wildlife, identification of wildlife habitat corridors, biodiversity, connectivity, those kinds of things. So we've got some new goals and policies, new policies around that. Other communities have done the same thing. They've added, though they're not required, they've named their chapters environment chapters. Some have named them sustainability and climate change. Others have called them environment and watershed health. But you get the idea. Communities are adding these chapters to address their environmental needs and to meet GMA requirements. So I'll start here with the key changes. Just in general, we updated data and some other details. In addition to adding new goals and policies and removing the redundancies, we focused everything under the focus areas. So you'll see those same focus areas, the housing and urban villages and so on, and we've put our new goals and policies under those areas that have been identified. Whereas in 2012, we sort of just wedged our chapter into the comp plan. This is much more integrated because we've had a chance to get input from different departments, and we've been able to develop these chapters together so they sync. And I was really pleasantly surprised to realized while Tara was giving her presentation just how much overlap the economic development chapter and the environment chapter have. We have some examples of that. Our new policies and goals are more clear and applicable. You'll see some definitions in the chapter and some text boxes, so things like workforce housing or watershed or life cycle, those things are defined so people can understand what we're saying. And then we've added some really useful maps by our talented GIS staff, and I think that you've been able to see those. So now I want to go through the key changes under those focus areas. The biggest one probably is that we've written a policy about promoting the Bellingham Restoration Technical Assessment. And you heard about this when we came before you with our Critical Area Ordinance update. And what it is it's a science-based assessment that looked at 4 different habitat types: wetlands, forests, meadows, and riverine habitats, and then prioritized our it will be used to prioritize our restoration and mitigation efforts. So we have more coordination with where we're doing our restoration, or we can identify quickly where we're probably not going to put resources. This will help, using this document will help meet a lot of goals and policies in this chapter. And what it's meant to do is to be used prior to or in the very early stages of design for new projects. So it can help focus where development should go or help focus where mitigation should go. And then under urban villages, to limit sprawl is really the underpinning of the Growth Management Act. So that's one of the goals. And then we've developed policies to help meet that. So things like emphasizing development in one of our 6 urban villages, or other smart land use decisions that minimize vehicle use. All that rain that we complain about really provides us with an opportunity to generate power with hydroelectric dams rather than burning fossil fuel. So that means we have really good air quality, and we're geographically located in a really opportune area that we get a lot of cleansing in our airshed. And it's primarily, though, that we don't burn fossil fuels here. We do have other sources of pollutants, transportation being the biggest sector. So that's our other source of air pollutants. But generally, our air quality is very good. We have policies to protect that. We also want to look at indoor air quality. As you know, that's been a mission of the Northwest Clean Air Agency. Under innovation, solar power is really becoming more commonplace. And I chose this photo because it's not just panels being put on new buildings, it's really established neighborhoods. You're seeing it everywhere. They're popping up in your neighborhood, they're popping up downtown. It's no longer just pilot projects. And in fact, we have so here's my first connection with another connection with the economic development chapter. We have a local business that makes solar panels. They employ a lot of people. They work with Western in getting people trained to work in their facility. And the climate here, both economic and otherwise, is actually pretty good for solar power. It turns out that trees provide a lot of natural services, and that's a term that we have defined in the chapter. Natural services are those services that environmental features provide that if they didn't provide them, we would have to build them and pay for them and fund them. So for example, trees help protect air quality and water quality. They help reduce energy costs. They even can provide food. So without those natural services, we'd be paying for those. Trees are really important. They're important to our sense of place. They're important to our environment. And we think that promoting an urban forestry management plan would help us ensure that our trees stay healthy and they're in the right places. Another policy under sustainability focus area is preserving policies to preserve and protect historic resources. Again, it embodies energy, it's reusing existing resources, and we've got some tourism. I mean, Fairhaven Village is a pretty hot spot for tourism. So some of these environmental features we have are actually economically beneficial, not just the natural services, but to our local economy. And then we have policies on promoting resiliency to climate change. And I think the focus is now more on adaptation to both major changes like climate change as well as natural disasters. How can we adapt to those things? We've got goals and policies on that. Those are the main changes. You'll see the new text in red in the chapter. Not very much different than the first set of goals and policies in the 2012 version. These just hit on the main ones. We did have one set of corrections that I think that you got. It's just a one-page. Oh, excuse me. It's like 1.5 pages. And I wanted to bring your attention to one of the policies that we're going to add in the environment chapter. I'll just read it. It's you have it in front of you, and it's not numbered yet, but we'll add it. We'll fold it into the chapter. And it says, encourage development of mitigation options that include a mitigation bank in lieu fee program. So that's just really saying that we want to explore options for mitigation. It's really part and parcel to development right now. We need mitigation options. So that's one that we'll add.
That's not in here right now.
It's not in here right now. There is a policy that's similar to that about mitigation, but this one to encourage development of mitigation options. As you know, the city's been, thank you, Lisa, the city's been exploring how to set up an in lieu fee program. The city has needs for mitigation too. We do major projects, we do road projects, we do sewer projects, we do all kinds of things, and we need our own mitigation. So we're looking at this policy would encourage the development of options, mitigation options. So that summarizes the main changes. Do you have any questions to start with?
Lisa.
So going back to the new policy that you're putting in, as far as mitigation, I know in the economic chapter, there's and I'll go back to it in a little bit, but it talks about stormwater mitigation and the mitigation bank and in lieu of fee program. So is this referring to stormwater, or is it encompassing more possible mitigations?
Right. This is really about wetland and habitat mitigation. This isn't about stormwater. We do have some new, well, since we're talking about this, there's a new proposed policy for the economic development chapter 2. I'll just mention it here. It's a revised policy number 33. So that one does deal with stormwater detention, but the one I just mentioned has really to do with wetland and habitat mitigation.
Could I make a suggestion that perhaps that is included in the policy just to help define what the mitigation is? Because I was thinking it was really kind of duplicating what was in the other chapter, and so I was a little bit confused on what this was, why this was different.
Sometimes we forget to clarify when we use the jargon all the time, so good suggestion.
Kim, I have a question. So this, like the economic development chapter, is fairly new, adopted in 2012. With a lot of environmental impacts being regulated by the Critical Areas Ordinance and regulated by other agencies outside of the City of Bellingham, Department of Ecology, Army Corps, in the last 4 years, can you kind of give, I guess, maybe some examples or an overview of how these policies have shaped land use decisions or actual regulations or the implementation of it? Just a general.
Right. Well, the way it's supposed to work is that the policies and goals set the foundation for regulations to then be adopted so that they're implemented. Let's see, I think I understand your question, but let me take a shoreline example. So we have goals and policies in here to protect shoreline resources. You know, the whole shoreline master program is part of the comp plan. And so you'll see when developments occur, that those features are developed in such a way that's consistent with the comp plan and with the regulations. So one kind of guides the other. It's kind of broader, longer-term thinking. An example, a new example might be the urban forestry management plan. It's something we kind of work around, but we don't have a master plan to help us with identifying what do we want to do, what resources do we have to protect our trees, where are we having problems, those kinds of things. So this will help us maybe develop either regulations or a management plan to help assist in ensuring that we maintain a good.
So the urban forestry, that would be I guess a management plan would be a tool that the city would have outside of these other agencies.
Right.
It seems like, and that's a good example. So are there any other, I guess, with regards to wetlands, buffers, how much flexibility does the city have in looking at, or habitat, say habitat master plans created, how much flexibility does the city have in creating regulations with regards to habitat corridors?
Well, we actually already have regulations for that. It's with the Critical Area Ordinance, people think usually about wetlands and streams, but it does also cover habitat corridors. This assessment really is just the science behind, it helps us identify those corridors, but also how they're functioning. So it really isn't meant, it's really just the science, it's the map that we've mapped them, we've got their attributes. It will just kind of fill in the gaps, if you will, because we already have the regulations to a certain extent to protect those areas. So this isn't a regulatory document, it just,
understood.
yeah. But it does help us a policy. We're going to have a policy that says that we're going to look at these things while as we develop development plans. Maybe it doesn't. It's not really meant to say you can't develop here and everything has to be saved. It's really about prioritizing and identifying the best places, like we've done with urban villages. We've said these are the best places for really dense, transit-oriented development. This will be kind of the similar thing. These are the best places for development, and these are the best places to leave as corridors, which is a GMA requirement.
Has the city adopted any regulations, environmental regulations that you feel, I guess, are advanced beyond state regs, ecology regs?
Let's see. Well, we have our stormwater regulations, our critical area regulations. We've got SEPA. SEPA is kind of that tool that we have for things that need protection that we don't have regulations for, that not just Bellingham, but anywhere. I really can't think of any. This is really just guidance. This is kind of more visionary. Climate change, the climate change section is one that we don't have regulations really. Well, we have air quality standards and federal and state standards for that, but locally we don't have regulations. But this is a policy document that says, for example, the city is going to operate our municipal facilities in such a way, or we're going to promote this thing through a certain sustainable business in the community. It's just guidance, really.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we'll move into discussion about both chapters, so thank you.
Okay,
And
you're welcome.
assume you'll be hanging with us here for a little bit. We'll probably have some more questions. Okay, so we'll get some lights on. That's good. Okay, we'll open it up to both economic development chapter and the environmental chapter. I think we'll go through and have some discussion and see if we can't.
Did you want to see if anyone wanted to
Yeah, that's
speak
right.
up on
Thank you.
issue? Okay.
We are going to take public comment, and we'll do that now. So step on up, and thanks, Steve.
Everybody please come down.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Twitchell from the BIAWC.
I am Linda Twitchell, Building Industry Association, Whatcom County, and the only audience member tonight. Okay. Couple of questions and just general comments on the economic development chapter. I think your ED1 your goal ED1 policies 1 through 5 are your strongest tools recommended here. That's positive stuff that might actually help move things forward. And let's see, I did have some other questions. The workforce housing reference on page 11 sounds like we're proposing that we deal with middle-income people's problems finding affordable housing they can afford, by producing more subsidized housing. That the programs for that in my mind says subsidized housing. I mentioned this during the housing chapter, but I would greatly appreciate it if the comp plan would look into, analyze, and seek solutions for some of the basic problems that are causing our tight housing market and rising prices. Because I'm convinced if we just deal with subsidized housing, we're going to spend our lives paying more taxes for subsidized housing. And I'd love to have us take a serious look in the comp plan, or encourage us to do so in the comp plan, to look at the underlying causes and address that. So that's comment number one on that. The urban village comment on page 12, let's see, of the economic, see if I can fish that out and see if we're all looking at the same thing here. Okay. Oops. The reference here is talking about, here we go, goal ED4. I'm still not convinced that continuing a policy of accommodating and managing growth primarily by encouraging development of mixed-use urban villages is going to resolve our problems, because as I have testified before, Lisa, you may not have heard this a million times, they have. The national research from both the realtors and the NAHB indicates that 80% of Americans don't want to live in multi-level denser housing. So to me, it's a kind of a contradiction in terms to say we oppose sprawl, but we're going to squish everybody into housing they don't want, because that tends to do what is happening now. It sends people to Ferndale, Linden, et cetera. Okay, you've heard that, but just to put that on the record. If I could look for a second at the environmental chapter, there is a comment here about supporting infill primarily in mixed-use urban villages and transit corridors in the staff memo, and it refers to policy EV37, which to my mind does not actually do that, and I'm wondering if we're, when I look at, where is EV37? Pull up the right one here. It says continue coordinated land use and transportation planning through implementation of the city's urban village plans and transit-oriented development along transit corridors, which sounds good, but it doesn't say anything about infill, and I'm wondering if there's a disconnect or I'm missing something there. There's also in the environmental chapter, I've got so many pieces here. Let me quick find where I am. Oh, okay. There's reference here to the urban forestry management plan, which you mentioned. Could you explain in a little more detail, is that regarding public lands or private property? I'm trying to envision how this thing would work. And that would be a good piece of detail if we could get in terms of, is this intended to say you have to have permission to cut down a tree in your backyard, or are we talking about Cornwall Park, or what are we dealing with on that? And let me look here. And I had a similar question about, under the housing, the use of habitat and restoration technical assessment in project design and review. I'm not clear what that is or how that would affect someone who is proposing building one or more homes. So a little more detail would be helpful so we could understand that better. And I'll let you go with that. Hey.
Thank you. Okay, who wants to get us started off here? I see lots of notes on lots of pamphlets here.
Well, I would start out, because I agree with what Linda Twitchell has said. I circled the same things about the work income housing availability, and I just have major concerns about something that is artificially subsidized or shifting the burden from one population to the other, and I'd want to make sure that we don't carry that forward either as an impression or implicitly or explicitly stated.
I have I guess a couple general things that I see throughout both, and I understand the focus of our 5 focus areas. Urban villages was a major focus when we're looking at this area. I think when we're talking about infill, we need to also include that we need to promote infill within the city limits and encourage growth in our urban villages. And I think, you know, we do that a little bit in the housing chapter. I think in some of these policies we should talk about infill within the city as well. It gives the impression that we're only looking to infill in urban villages. And when we looked at our land capacity analysis and our growth projections, we looked at a lot of areas that are still single-family housing. And I think, you know, promoting and relating back to housing, promoting growth within the city as well as the urban villages is important. And there's several areas that we can do that. So just a general note when we're talking about housing. Steve?
Okay, I also agree with some of the comments from Ms. Twitchell and have a question for Ms. Sundin. When I look back over the last workshops we've had, and when I look at this, I get the feeling that we are more centered on affordable housing, infill housing, vice growing our jobs base. I've always thought that jobs come first, then the people will follow. We're putting too much emphasis on the housing area, vice giving incentives for the business growth area. And following on that, on page 4, goal ED3, says maintain an adequate supply of developable employment lands. What I've seen recently is a decline in this city by variances for industrial, light industrial, and commercial lands, shifting them to the multifamily variance zoning. What is your thought on this chicken and the egg concept? Is there one area we should be concentrating on? I know you're probably going to say you should do both at the same time, but I'm very, very concerned about what lands we have now that are designated industrial, light industrial. We're just seeing right now, totally in conflict with the map on 9/7 of employment capacity. It's labeled industrial lands in the north end of the city. I find out that there is a project of approximately 10 acres that comes under the purple coloring for industrial that was annexed way back when, and it was vested by a church in 2003, and they're going to put in 6 buildings and 260 units. Can't do anything about it. We inherited that. It stands today. 13 years later, we're still stuck with it. So all I see is every time I turn around, the most important to me is commercial industrial lands are being diminished. I would just like to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll let Greg probably chime in on this as well, because he's closer to the analysis on our land supply. But I think it's important that for that economic diversification piece, that we have a variety of lands available for economic activity, and that includes industrial. What we have in some of our industrial areas is it's called industrial, but we have a lot of commercial uses that are allowed in those areas, and that's probably been as a result of our economy over time, is light industrial lands. Our country wasn't growing manufacturing for decades. We've seen that happen, and so there's been this pressure over over time, to add more uses. I do think it's important moving forward that we do protect, that's one land use classification I think is really important to keep clean, because once you add commercial to it, the value of the property goes up to that commercial value. And it's hard for light industrial, and when we talk industrial in Bellingham, we're not talking like heavy industrial, I think, just for Linda and maybe anyone else watching. It's mostly light industrial, but that is an area that I think moving forward we have to protect. We did some of that with the waterfront development, something to keep an eye on. It's hard to go backwards though. So once you allow those uses in, to take them away is difficult to do.
I really believe that, I think number 4, Bellingham accommodates and manages growth primarily through these urban villages. I had that also circled on mine. We received, I don't know if you saw it, an excellent email from a Raymond Deliker, and he makes a couple comments in it, and he says, he quotes the draft plan. He says that most of Bellingham's future economic growth will likely come from expansion of businesses that are already located here. He diametrically opposes that. He says, in fact, contrary is true. New businesses, not existing ones, generate new jobs. So I'll tie that in. I think it's so important for us to maintain these areas. I would go so far as to say a moratorium on any more conversion of industrial and commercial areas to include multifamily housing. I just see it going away, and it's going away, and there's no business or employment, higher wages coming available, and that's my primary concern.
I have noted that the use of the word primarily in that goal statement about urban villages. I think that I'll connect back with Lisa and Greg tomorrow. We want to make sure that this goal is consistent with your land use goals. And I know that we're accommodating growth in other ways besides urban villages. And so that word might be a little strong, but I'd like to connect back with Lisa and Greg on that, the use of that word.
Okay, thank you.
One quick thing. Yeah, I think that kind of goes, I didn't want to make a specific point into where to insert that, but, goal ED4, Bellingham accommodates, it could say Bellingham accommodates growth within the current boundaries, city, boundaries in the current UGA, primarily focusing on encouraging development of mixed-use urban villages. You're seeing that in the economic development chapter and the environmental chapter. I just want to make sure that we're consistent about the fact that when we looked at our land capacity analysis, we had a lot of growth identified in areas outside of our urban villages. So we don't want to give the impression that if there was conflicting goals and policies that we're forgetting about the rest of infill potential in Bellingham. And we've seen a lot of Patton Trails, Fairhaven Highlands. We've seen a lot of housing projects come through and haven't been fully realized, and that impacts housing costs and everything else. If there's a lot of policy language that only specifically mentions urban villages and doesn't give credence to the infill potential within the city, I think we got to be careful about that.
Under the land and infrastructure piece, you'll see us call out specifically keeping an eye on that light industrial land. What we're doing with the urban villages, and we'll take a look at how we're framing that. It is somewhere, it is a location that we do want to emphasize. That's where the city is investing in, look at our investments in the waterfront district. This is a location where not light industrial, well, for the waterfront light industrial, but downtown might not be that place where light industrial goes, but those other wages that we want to see, those tech jobs, and I mean, to go back to that wage issue, those upper story, we want to see those places be a really thriving place, not just for retail on the ground floor, but to support those other jobs and some of the other sectors that we're trying to bring in here beyond that retail and beyond light industrial.
Good. Lisa?
Oh, just tying in a little bit with this, it was also the protection and preservation of our light industrial land. It was something when I interviewed for this, when I was asked what did I see as being one of the most kind of critical issues that Bellingham looks at over the next 10 years, that was one of my top things to focus on. And so when I looked through here, I did see little bits and pieces, like on page 10, support the retention and growth of industrial manufacturing sectors, but it's really talking about employment. And I would really like, unless it's in there and I really just did not see it, but I'd really like to see something in here that addresses the not only the preservation of what we have, but perhaps an eye towards when we move into the UGA, the identification of additional industrial manufacturing. Because I do agree that as we've kind of opened the gate and commercial and other uses have come into that land, we don't have an infinite amount of land to go into over the next, not just 20 years, but 50 years. So we really do need to protect that area so that it can bring in jobs, because obviously retail is not the highest paying, and what will be paying is, it's not just office jobs and bank jobs and jobs from the university. Those might have some stability to it, but I would really love to see more manufacturing coming in, because that can offer a better livable wage. So I'd love to see something in here that does speak a little bit about not only maintaining it, but protecting it from, additional uses that are outside of that type of zoning, like retail. Because I can think of some property that we haven't annexed that, there's talk that, retail wants to go in there, but it's so close to the highway and it's a perfect area for light manufacturing. And so I don't think we've taken it into Bellingham yet, but I would like to see something stronger in here to help preserve that.
And we do have a policy in the land use chapter, I think speaks to what you're saying. It says it's LU 26, industrial zone land in the UGA should be reserved for industrial uses and appropriate accessory uses. So we could repeat that here. But that, I think, is exactly what you're saying, and we agree that those remaining industrial lands in our UGA should be reserved for industrial uses.
And I know we try not to necessarily keep duplicating, but I think it's just a really critical component to economic that it would be really nice to have that in there.
I think, I would agree. I think a good word that was used by Lisa is identifying. If you look at policy ED 30, which says coordinating city investments in utilities, transportation, facilities with other business and employment opportunities, I think, we may want to look at adding the word identify and coordinate city investments in utilities. And how this regards to light industrial, if you take, there's property within our city that is zoned light industrial that's not accessible, like off Baker Street, south of I-5, just north of Bellingham Cold Storage. There's a lot of residential properties that are, that are older on large lots. That's zone light industrial. There's a prerequisite condition in the zoning table that prior to the development of those properties that traffic improvements need to be made at the intersection of Baker and Guy Meridian. A traffic light needs to be added. That would be a perfect identification of, if light industrial is in high demand, is to look at those, go through those zoning tables, identify, and then coordinate. Maybe that's a good public investment to not make that a requisite requirement for somebody that wants to purchase 2 acres, because there's about 20 acres there. Maybe the city would invest in putting in the needed infrastructure. That zoning requirement could get removed. You probably see some development there. So that's an example of, identifying that. I would like to see stronger policy language on how that's achieved. Like how are these properties identified, and how is that coordination happening between departments? Because that would be an interdepartment discussion between Public Works and Planning, and saying, hey, here's an opportunity. So policy ED 30, maybe we can strengthen that up a little bit.
Well, I'd like to just say that I agree that our focus, I'd feel much more comfortable focusing on attracting businesses and working with, creating good jobs here rather than focusing on the housing thing. I think that takes our attention in the wrong direction. I would like to see us back off the housing and focus on attracting businesses and maintaining them and our industrial areas available. And I totally agree with coming in and filling in some of the infrastructure so those become attractive spaces. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, workforce housing would be an ancillary benefit to higher wage jobs. So maybe stating that in policy ED 28 as a secondary goal or to creating the jobs.
Or to say as a result of something.
Lisa?
Now, my 2 cents is that I do believe housing is an equal component to the economic, because you could have great jobs, but if you don't have a place for people like an urban village to be able to have a place to live and get on a bus and get to their job. I know people who commute great distances, and it gets pretty old after a while when you have to commute to work. I do think, because I know a lot of people who work for housing, it's not necessarily that it has to be subsidized, but it just has to be, we need more housing so that hopefully the prices will eventually level out, so a single-family home doesn't rent to people for $3,500, because that's not workforce housing level unless you pack 10 people in it. So I kind of respectfully disagree a little bit that, I think housing is an important component. I just think we need to strengthen a little bit more of some of the job and economic component to help balance it out so that it doesn't seem like it's a disproportionate priority.
Actually, I don't disagree with you. I was probably a little strong in my last statement, but I think that we shouldn't get myopically focused on housing when it is actually going to be a byproduct. And I'd like to see a lot of economic, the market take care of a lot of things. I think developers would build to the market level that people are interested in buying. And I'd like to see us sort of let that market development run the game here rather than artificially imposing our will on it.
We have a very small audience today. I see Ms. Twitchell raising her hand. We'll give you a quick moment to, did you have a clarification that you'd like to make?
I have a question, point to consider. Linda Twitchell again. Here's a thought I just want to make people aware of, and you guys may be aware of this, but we have great emphasis on mixed use, and I think it's neat if we could have attractive and invigorated urban villages and get as many people there as want to go there. That's great. But a concern we're seeing in terms of market is the mixed use that we're getting to this point. There, from what I hear from hanging around with the realtors too much, is that the rentals are going a mile a minute because of lack of housing in this area, but they can't give away the commercial space on the first floors. And I don't know if there's some way more commercial than retail could somehow be incentivized or encouraged or something to that effect in your urban villages or in your mixed use zones. But I know lack of light industrial land is a real consideration. And if we have so much retail that tends to be part-time, low-wage jobs, is there some other way to incentivize or encourage other economic activity in all these mixed-use zones that we're pushing? Is just a thought I wanted to leave with people.
Thank you. I comment on two of the policies in the economic development chapter. By the way, I think this chapter is great. This is a good addition to our comp plan. Very good. Those two policies talk about wetland mitigation and stormwater, regional stormwater. How much discussion has been in interaction with Public Works? Have they been consulted on that? Because I know that some of these programs, I know they are exploring the feasibility of regional stormwater and in lieu of, I think even to a further degree that they're looking at stormwater options. I'm just wondering if these are inclusive enough, if this language is strong enough based on where the current trend's going.
So Public Works, they participated in the first draft, and I understand this is the revised language that Public Works wants, right? Yeah.
Well, either one of us can speak to this, but we had a lengthy discussion with several Public Works staff members over all the stormwater and wetland mitigation policies. We compiled all of them for them into one document that, because there's several throughout the plan, and made sure that they were all consistent with each other, and they said what everyone wanted them to say. So.
I guess the thing that, on the wetland mitigation, and maybe Kim can speak to this, is selecting mitigation sites, and after first considering on-site mitigation, that to me clearly says that, the first priority is to try to do on-site mitigation. The second priority would be to look at other options. Is that the best, method and way to pose that?
Right. Well, we started that policy with the first thing we said was that they should be based on current state mitigation guidance, primarily, because that isn't just looking at Bellingham, what Bellingham wants, it's statewide. And that really says, choose the best site. Choose a site that's going to be most successful. Choose the site where, because you can't just go create a wetland anywhere or enhance a wetland anywhere. So that's the guidance, and that's the latest science. And then after that, consider on-site mitigation or in-basin, and then a mitigation bank, excuse me. But it's not regulated that way. We have a lot of flexibility, as you might know. And that other new policy speaks to that, like other mitigation options, because the bank is being used and it is a tool, and we do want it here. We're fortunate to have it at the Lummi property that's the Lummi Mitigation Bank. But this really is, first it says, follow the guidance. And so each wetland biologist has to address that guidance. Sometimes the on-site is actually the most affordable thing to do, because you're not having to pay the bank, you're not having to go purchase property, you can do something right there. Other times it's not. It's really, really site by site, and we've had enough flexibility. We would not generally prevent someone from choosing their preferred option if they can document that they're following the best available science.
Do the state regs say that you have to consider the site first, though, that you have to look at mitigation options on site? Is it just say you have to consider them and weigh them and show your, demonstrate your, I guess, justification or your decision?
Part of it is, it used to be that way. It used to be that it had to be like on the same site or at least in the same basin, and we've broadened it quite a bit. In fact, the Army Corps is on the way other end of the spectrum when they want most everything to go to the bank, because it's already there. The wetland is already there. It's a done deal. But with these, so it doesn't say you have to do this site, but sometimes what will happen in Bellingham as we grow is we don't want to lose those natural services I talked about earlier. We don't want to lose all those. Not only do they provide the environmental services, but they're some of our nice backdrops, or some of our, protection next to the industrial land, or, they have other functions too. So we're trying to get people to look at the best fit for the mitigation, start with on-site, then in-basin. So kind of a sequence of things. This is just visionary again, it's not regulatory, and we see options, mitigation options, the whole range.
I think the inclusion of alternatives and options is great. I mean, we have to look at, all habitat, human habitat, we have to grow somewhere. So I would suggest, if the flexibility is there, to remove the wording "first consider" on site and just say, provide options and alternatives, and look and demonstrate the best option, and leave that to people. If we have that flexibility within our interpretation of enforcement of the code, then why not leave that? Why try to direct it towards on-site first?
Well, I think this is something that staff has discussed quite a bit, and we use the word consider very purposefully, because it doesn't say first try it on site, and if that doesn't work, then you can go to something else. But
Okay.
First consider it, and we see a lot of projects do that. that is what they considered, because it really is, it makes the most sense environmentally, economically, fits the
Sometimes
site
it would,
plan.
yeah.
Sometimes it does. But it's just, this is just some kind of, because we haven't really addressed mitigation before, and we've had a lot of questions. So this is just meant to be some guidance. And then the additional policy says, encourage the development of these other mitigation, wetland and habitat mitigation options, so that we have a full range, because it's going to change over time. We may have an in lieu fee program someday. We have the mitigation bank and it's being used. Hopefully it still stays open, and so there's everything from on-site to the mitigation bank. I think I hear what you're saying, though, that you want to be flexible.
Yeah, I think language, just if the direction of Public Works, I mean, they're looking into these, mitigation sites, or they're looking into the feasibility of them, in lieu options. I think if the, public resources are going to be directed into trying to identify other options, that our policy language in this chapter that's related but not directly related should be a little more encompassing, just providing more options. So, I mean, I guess I won't suggest specific language, but I think that can be a little bit more expansive, and maybe we could see a different draft prior to the April here.
We'll have the other policy next to it, so we'll see if we can fine-tune those two so you can see them next to each other. That might be helpful, too.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. Lisa.
As far as in the environmental chapter under air quality, I was wondering, has there been a kind of a survey done to find out how many households heat with wood or pellet stoves? Or is there a primary source for heat? I do know a couple of people who use wood stoves primarily for their heat in wintertime, and they're lower income, so just trying to talk with them about some of the options out there to provide better heat for them. And I didn't know if Bellingham's really kind of looked at that, and if they have a sense of numbers, and if so, if there is a plan to address, making informational contacts with those homeowners and residents as far as trying to convert them over to a cleaner energy source for heat in order to help preserve air quality.
Right. The City of Bellingham hasn't directly, but the Northwest Clean Air Agency does. That they're the body that deals with wood stoves and education and enforcement. And it's not something that's I've heard much about, or I haven't heard complaints. I haven't heard of any issues really surrounding that. But we also don't really deal with it because it's an air quality issue. And we do have the Northwest Clean Air Agency, which does have an office in Bellingham. So I don't know of an inventory, but they might have that. I know that's one of their programs, for sure.
And another resource we have in our community is the weatherization program that's run by the Opportunity Council. And it's not identifying necessarily that wood stove issue, but it's looking at low-income families and making sure that they can afford their bills. And so if you're seeing wood stove burning, it's probably because it's less costly in that case. And so the weatherization program is kind of to tighten up that house, and looking at windows and insulation, and that's available through, I would if you feel comfortable, let them know about that resource.
We've gotten wood from the Opportunity Council, so.
Tara, I was looking at the Appendix B, the SWOT analysis, and this was from 2010, I think, right? That was a study that was done just looking at our kind of, to set the groundwork for this chapter. I get one of the things is just a diversification in demographics. Like, we're seeing, and studies would show that in our city that we have a high population of young people, probably due to Western and the educational opportunities, and then we have some aging population, middle-aged boomers, like everybody else. We have a smaller proportion of the 30, 35, 28 to 38 year olds, and is probably a direct relation to some of the professional job opportunities that are here. We have a high, degree of retail jobs. I'm just wondering if we should have some policy statement just in the economic development chapter recognizing the importance of a diverse demographic base in our community. How do we promote that? I don't know. That's just for thought. But that, I think, is, related to sort of the job, opportunities that are out there for people after college.
I think, I think that it's the diversification of jobs
Would promote that,
that
yeah.
brings the diversification of the demographic.
I agree. Lisa?
Just a question on clarification. Under opportunities, it lists shipping terminal. I'm assuming that's a Bellingham shipping terminal? Okay. I would assume since we're talking Bellingham, but we also incorporate the wider Whatcom County in some of this document. So I just wanted to make sure we weren't referring to the proposal out of Cherry Point.
Would you mind pointing that out to me? If you can.
Yes, I just was on that page too, and I flipped it. It's under opportunities at the end.
Thank you.
Yeah, it just says shipping terminal, and I was just thinking
That would be the
adding-
Bellingham shipping terminal. Do you guys see any problem with adding that word in there?
That might be, I figured that's what it was, but given that there's other components in here that mentions Whatcom County, I thought it might be good to highlight the difference.
Oh, going back to that supplement there, one of the threats that was listed was just the perception of cleanliness and safety in our downtown core. I think we should have a policy statement, if there isn't one already, about, the continued push and, beautification of downtown and making an emphasis on creating a perception of safety and cleanliness downtown. Because I think that's a very real concern and perception. I've talked to a lot of people, my wife and I own a business downtown, so we get to interact with a lot of people downtown, and I think it's a real, not only a perception, but a real concern. And it has an effect on lease rates, shoppers, foot traffic, and do we have a policy about cleaning up downtown?
We have a policy ED 41, which the city actually, beyond the Economic Development Strategic Action Plan, which we may have something specified in there, but we have a whole implementation strategy focused on downtown. And there are 40 or 50 different actions that the city's taking, and beautification is just one of them. I think that's really important. I just would worry about calling just that one thing out about downtown. But why don't I go back and talk to our team about that one? And
Yeah, ED 41 has, it's pretty expansive, but
it's broad, yeah.
But that is along those lines. I guess if you weren't familiar with that action plan, it would be a little hard to know that is an emphasis. Yeah.
we could even word, we say attractive there. We could add the word clean, or, clean and safe.
Safe. Yeah,
Welcoming, yeah.
Welcoming. Another way of saying safe.
And clean.
Yeah, unique elections, safe. Yeah, so maybe just a little stronger language on that would probably meet the intent, so. That's it for my comments. Going once? Okay, Lisa. Don't feel rushed. If you got comments, let's hear them.
I'd love to go home eventually. Under also the economic under threats, not that it's there, but I also think an area of concern is if we do have a rapid growth, to make sure that that we don't have an undeveloped infrastructure in order to support that. I know that, there's the talk eventually, not that this involves going out into the UGA, but I think in some areas of Bellingham, I think because we'll deal with parks and everything coming up, but I think one of the threats would be the not having the appropriate infrastructure for potential housing boom, especially out at the Cordata area and some other areas of Bellingham that are a little bit underserved by some of the amenities that we enjoy in Bellingham. So I don't know if something could be added in there, that would be a concern for, I always think of threat being something, a safety aspect, but I could see that being an area to address.
Okay. Well, I think that concludes our discussion on these two chapters. I thought both were succinct, well written. I enjoyed the economic development chapter. I think that's a really good chapter to have part of our comp plan and create some balance to, these two chapters, some people could see as being juxtaposed. They, but they need to balance each other, and I think we're working towards that. So that'll be the end of our public hearing, or our work session, I'm sorry, and then we'll take a director's report from Mr. Aka.
I don't think we have anything to report, Mr. Chairman. We need the two commissioners who weren't here tonight to get healthy. And we will see you on March 31st to talk about the community design and Parks, Recreation, and Open Space chapters. Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.